So regarding the infections, as we mentioned, that mostly this is the those IgM infections secondary to with the secondary cold hemagglutinin disease that are associated with mycoplasma pneumoniae and infectious mononucleosis that are important, and also hepatitis C. So these are the main three types that are dealt with in the infections part. So regarding the infections, the mycoplasma associated infections. Although a secondary cold hemagglutinin disease is a rare complication of mycoplasma infections, atypical or mycoplasma pneumonia account for 33% of all cold hemagglutinin disease patients. So in one series that was they've already mentioned that mostly about 33% of patients they presented this of 33% of all the child patients they presented with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and influenza A has also been associated. So mycoplasma and also even Haemophilus influenza A, but the pathogen is not always identified, and so a CHAD typically occurs 2 to 3 weeks after onset of the illness. So this is in this case the cold hemagglutinin in case of cold hemagglutinin disease, or mostly after 2 to 3 weeks after the onset of the infection, the patient presents with acrocyanosis, hemoglobinuria, or gangrene. If the patient presents with this type of anemia, and this extreme sort of acrocyanosis, hemoglobinuria, or gangrene are uncommon, and the hemolysis typically resolves after a further 2 to 3 weeks. So here in basically in as we read earlier also, the primary cold hemagglutinin disease mostly occurs in elderly, and acrocyanosis and Raynaud's phenomena are more common in those in primary chad, but in secondary chad, which occurs in childhood associated with childhood infections, particularly 2 to 3 weeks after the and sort of respiratory infections, this could be mycoplasma pneumonia or influenza A. So 2 to 3 weeks after the onset of the illness, these patients, these children, they have this autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and that is they present with the secondary cold hemagglutinin disease, and this is also self-limiting. That is the primary hemagglutinin disease presents with acrocyanosis and Raynaud's phenomena, and here there also gangrene is there, may also occur, and hemoglobinuria is then a component of the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria disease. So all these features are uncommon with secondary chad, which is associated with only with respiratory infection, and 2 to 3 weeks after the infection, they may develop this autoimmune hemolytic component, but this resolves after a further 2 to 3 weeks. So it is self-limiting in children. Most patients can be managed supportively with antibiotics, so even just plain antibiotics, or if there is unresolved pneumonia. So if you not previously treated them with antibiotics for the respiratory tract illness, you can just you can actually reinstitute the antibiotic therapy, or or start the antibiotics if they've not been previously treated well, treated, and then just warmth and transfusion for the symptomatic anemia patients is all that is required. So the transfusion here would also be ABO, RH, and KL matched, and then it would need to be given through blood warmers. Some patients, so one of the considerations is that in case of these infectious patients with cold hemagglutinins, they just need we can give them just warm blood transfusion if they have symptomatic anemia. Otherwise, we can just adopt and wait and watch that approach. And some patients have also received corticosteroids or immunoglobulins, although whether they influence the acute course of hemolysis is unknown, because most of this is self-limiting in itself. So basically, antimicrobials is the treated is the recommended option with appropriate antimicrobials and a warm environment and transfusion for symptomatic anemia. And if hemolysis is severe, then we can go for emergency steroids or IV immunoglobulins. But they have mentioned that these may not particularly be needed, especially if you go ahead with the transfusion. This could actually be just sort of in those cases with severe and persistent hemolysis. even despite the transfusion. If the hemolysis is severe and persistent, then we can consider to give them steroids or IV immunoglobulins um, alongside their regular management. So for infectious mononucleosis, so this is the management for mycoplasma. For infectious mononucleosis, also the presenting feature here in case of mycoplasma, the disease occurs in 33% per percent of all child patients will have mycoplasma infections, and in case of infectious mononucleosis, 3% of patients with infectious mononucleosis typically develop uh, present with autoimmune hemolytic anemias. So for and this occurs 1 to 2 weeks of within 1 to 2 weeks of onset, and patients present with sore throat, fever, and malaise, followed by weakness and jaundice. So in this case, there is weakness and jaundice, and apart from the respiratory and upper respiratory tract throat infections, lymphadenopathy and hepatosplenomegaly are also common. So in this case, there will be hepatosplenomegaly and lymphadenopathy as well. And this is classically associated with the anti-small I cold agglutinin with high thermal amplitude. And most cases are self-limiting within 4 to 8 weeks. So in the case of mycoplasma, they were just 2 to 3 weeks after the illness. They occurred and they would go away also in about another 2 to 3 weeks. But in case of infectious mononucleosis, they not only appear a bit earlier, that is 1 to 2 weeks after onset, and they're also more severe, and then they also last a bit longer, that is about 4 to 8 weeks. So this is a sort of difference between infectious mononucleosis and mycoplasma pneumonia infections. That is, they appear within 1 to 3 weeks of onset, and they may also be more severe. But even then, they are also self-limiting. And some benefit has been reported in patients treated with steroids and with plasma exchange in a steroid refractory case. So in those cases, plasma exchange is also recommended. So patients with mild hemolysis can be monitored for resolution, where patients with severe hemolysis may require prednisolone. So unlike in cases, because this is infectious mononucleosis, would mostly require, since this would be an intracellular sort of disease, so antibiotics alone would not be appropriate, just like the ones required for mycoplasma. And so for these cases, prednisolone is given for severe hemolysis, and then we need to just exchange that those affected RBCs which have those affected lymphocytes which have these infectious mononucleosis. So if plasma exchange would then be required for steroid refractory case. And then also they should be the patient should avoid cold exposure. So this is also another component that, of course, we have dealt with also with the same as in mycoplasma infection. So in mycoplasma also we consider this cold avoidance and warm temperatures, so warm surroundings, and transfusion may be given. And antibiotics are the first line. Then transfusion may be given if more severe, and then if more severe and persistent, then prednisolone and IVIG given. In case of infectious mononucleosis, if there hemolysis is mild, it can be monitored. But if it is severe, then we would need to give steroids to decrease the immune response, and just wait for the infection to subside, for the lymphocytes to overcome this invading agent. And then if it persists, then we may even need to go for plasma exchange in steroid refractory cases. So with hepatitis C, in cases where autoimmune hemolytic anemia is thought to be secondary to interferon. So in hepatitis C, now we have like mostly cases with autoimmune hemolytic anemia secondary to interferon therapy. So if this is so, if this is secondary to interferon, then the interferon therapy should be discontinued. And in severe interferon associated cases, steroids have also been employed prior to resolution of hemolysis. So in eradication treatment, if the patient with hepatitis C has autoimmune hemolytic anemia without having received any sort of treatment with interferons, then 15 to 16 patients had a complete response to first line prednisolone, and that is 0.5 to 2 milligram per kg per day, to additionally receive cyclophosphamide or azathioprine also. And 2 steroid refractory patients responded to rituximab 375 milligram per meter square weekly for 4 weeks. However, viral load can increase in patients receiving steroids, and the main reported cause of death is liver failure. So, so hepatitis C eradication should therefore also be considered. So, so in patients who are receiving treatment, mostly the cause would then be treatment associated, that is associated with interferon. So even there, the treatment can be discontinued, and we may even have to employ steroids for resolution of the hemolysis. So this is for those patients who are on treatment for hepatitis C. In treatment naive cases, if autoimmune hemolytic anemia develops, then they are treated along the lines of primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia with prednisolone and cyclophosphamide and azathioprine. But cyclophosphamide in mostly with warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias, we considered azathioprine, cyclosporine, and adanazole, and all those other reagents. And cyclophosphamide is a new addition that is specifically for patients with hepatitis C. And then here also rituximab may also be used in this case. So with treatment naive, we can go with prednisolone, azathioprine, cyclophosphamide, and rituximab. And however, even if with these treatments, we need to consider treatment for hepatitis C eradication as well, because untreated, the viral load can increase. So if interferon-induced immune hemolytic anemia is suspected, that is, it is drug-induced, so then we need to discontinue the interferon. If, however, it is secondary, and consider steroids for severe persistent hemolysis. If the patient is treatment naive, then we can give them first line prednisolone. And in cases of controlled autoimmune hemolytic anemia, that is with prednisolone, or if we have added rituximab or other azathioprine or other agents, and then autoimmune hemolytic anemia is once it is controlled, we need to go along with the hepatitis C eradication, because the viral load can increase because of the treatments with these immune suppressive agents. So in case of immune dysregulation, this could either be like the autoimmune diseases, like particularly SLE, and also with this immune dysfunction due to this common variable immunodeficiency. So these are the two main, and then also with ulcerative colitis, and though that following hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, and the one with solid organ transplantation. So we'll take them one by one. If we can start with this systemic lupus erythematosus, then a positive that is present now in a lot of, we had discussed that with NHL, the frequency was 2 to 3%. With the Hodgkin's lymphoma, it was 0.2% only in cases of neoplasms. And with the other solid tumors, it was not very consistent. Then with infections, we had mycoplasma, where the frequency was almost about 33%. And with infectious mononucleosis, we are just about 3% association of patients who develop this autoimmune hemolytic anemias. And with hepatitis C, they've not mentioned any sort of case, although they mentioned that most of the cases they are secondary to interferon. So so with the with SLE, the incidence is quite increased. It is mostly about 18 to 65%. So there's a wide range of patients who can present with a positive DAT, and autoimmune hemolytic anemia occurs in 5 to 10%. So DAT can be positive, but the hemolytic anemia component, that is hemolysis, would mostly be evident in 5 to 10%. So, and approximately 2/3 of the cases occur at SLE presentation. So that being positive, we have to first of all, because it can be positive in other autoimmune conditions as well. So in 18 to 65 patients, most of the patients with SLE, they will have a positive DAT, but hemolysis and anemia would be will occur mostly in 5 to 10%. And approximately 2/3 of the cases occur at SLE presentation, but autoimmune hemolytic anemia can be present first. So in 2/3 of the cases, majority of the cases, it is concurrent with the SLE. And the initial steroid treatment results in a 75 to 96% response rate. So steroids here would be sort of required for the disease remission in case of SLE as well, and for the autoimmune hemolytic anemia treatment also. So there is a much greater response rate, and the recurrence rate estimated at 3 to 4 per 100 patient years. And where autoimmune hemolytic anemia is a dominant feature, so where autoimmune hemolytic anemia is the dominant feature, case reports suggest that oral immunosuppressants such as azathioprine or mycophenolate mofetil and may be useful agents. So danazol, in cases where the autoimmune hemolytic anemia is more dominant, so mostly the steroids would be like used for both the disease and for the autoimmune hemolytic anemia component. And here the response rates have been like 75, initial response rates have been 75 to 96%. But where autoimmune hemolytic anemia is the dominant feature, then case reports suggest that oral immunosuppressants such as azathioprine or mycophenolate mofetil may be useful agents. So danazol can also act as a steroid sparing agent, and the reported response rate was 60% in a series of 15 patients with secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia, 12 of whom had SLE. And rituximab also, so danazol and rituximab can also be considered in refractory lupus. And they also have a successful used in small number, including complete remission. So the treatment options in those patients with uh, SLE is that we could go for initial steroids, and if it could treat the disease as well as the hemolysis. And if hemolysis is the more dominant portion component, then we can even go on with azathioprine or mycophenolate mofetil. And in those patients, may danazol may also act as a steroid sparing agent, and the response rate is 60% in patients with secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And rituximab may also be considered here. So in a series of patients undergoing splenectomy, three out of three patients responded, but but two responses were partial, requiring additional medical therapy. So the first line, I think in comparison of 15 patients with ITP, if we compare SLE with ITP, then autoimmune hemolytic anemia treated medically versus who received splenectomy, the frequency of cytopenias was the same. Splenectomy should therefore be reserved for failure of medical management. So basically, we go with all like autoimmune disease disorders, including SLE. We'll go with the steroids first, and then second line would be azathioprine, mycophenolate mofetil, danazol, and rituximab. And splenectomy, as I mentioned, that it may cure the disease, but it is more in ITP that it can cure this sort of autoimmune hemolytic anemia associated with ITP, as in Evans syndrome. But in this SLE type, the most of the if it is controlled by medical management, splenectomy may not be required. Now, with common variable immunodeficiency, immune dysregulation leading to autoimmunity, especially immune cytopenias, is a common manifestation of primary immunodeficiencies. And common variable immunodeficiency is the most frequently clinically expressed primary immunodeficiency in adults. And autoimmune hemolytic anemia occurs in 4 to 7% of common variable immunodeficiency patients, and fewer patients appear to develop immune cytopenias while receiving a maintenance immunoglobulin therapy. So in this case, we have these common variable immune deficiency patients. So here the frequency they mentioned is around about like 4 to 7%. With the common variable immune deficiency states, there is a four, like we had with SLE, the frequency was 5 to 10%, and here with the common variable, we have a frequency of 4 to 7%. Patients, they may develop autoimmune hemolytic anemias, and uh, most of, if these patients had been receiving maintenance immunoglobulins, then the fewer patients they develop these immune cytopenias. So therapy similar to primary warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia can be considered, although lower doses and shorter treatment periods have been recommended. So steroids are usually effective first line, and so here also the steroids would treat the disease and the hemolytic component as well. So here they mentioned that patients receiving rituximab also responded well, and then also patients with receiving and patients with splenectomy also did well. But however, most of they have mentioned that most could like relapse, and post splenectomy infections were then more common with the common variable immune deficiency patients. And in these cases, life-threatening infection with streptococci pneumonia or Neisseria meningitis can occur. So all had discontinued prophylactic penicillin. In the larger study, they have mentioned that patients developed a bacterial meningitis or pneumococcal sepsis post-splenectomy. 7 episodes were within 3 years of splenectomy, and 7 out of 9 patients were not on IVIG replacement. So the recommendations, I think we just go with the recommendation that the therapy is to be is mostly the first line is the steroids, and then second line, as with SLE, we could also go for like these immune suppressants, and here rituximab is more commonly used. In SLE, they had even mentioned azathioprine and mycophenolate mofetil, but here rituximab is the second line, and in third line, they have mentioned splenectomy here. And but of course, the patients who require splenectomy should also receive lifelong prophylactic antibiotics, and because otherwise the chances of infection with the streptococcus pneumonia and Neisseria meningitis is then more common. Patients receiving steroid immunosuppression or splenectomy should also receive maintenance IVIG. So the maintenance IVIG is of course they should receive this for the uh, treatment of this immune deficiency disorder that they have. So IVIG maintenance, they should be on maintenance IVIG, and then for the treatment of the hemolytic component, they can receive the steroids, rituximab, and also splenectomy can be given along with the immunosuppression. And but splenectomy, after splenectomy, they need to go for a lifelong prophylactic antibiotics. Now, with ulcerative colitis, they mentioned that patients with ulcerative colitis can also develop autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and here the incidence is 0.5 to 0.7%, and if and this also occurs when the disease is active, and the control of this disease would be central to the management. And CMV reactivation and common in such patients and associated with autoimmune hemolytic anemia should be excluded. So with ulcerative colitis, another sort of a differential that we need to consider when we're considering the cause of autoimmune hemolytic anemia would be not only the association with autoimmune disease, but also a CMV reactivation. So results with steroids and a single agent are disappointing with remission in 5 out of 18 patients. However, if steroids are combined with other immunosuppressants, mostly they've mentioned here that steroids combined with immunosuppressants like cyclosporin or thiopurine and or infliximab. So all these sort of other immunosuppressive therapies, they can, along with steroids, they can they can they have important immunosuppression is most frequently a thiopurine with successful use of cyclosporine or infliximab. And resolution of both autoimmune hemolytic anemia and colitis occurs in 10 out of 10 patients following colectomy. So here also the removal of this affected portion of the colon along with splenectomy has resulted in resolution of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So the treatment of the underlying cause is there, yet you have to treat it, either you can resect it or you can treat it with oral prednisolone and immunosuppressive agents like azathioprine or or cyclophosphamide, and even infliximab. In refractory cases, we need um, with active colitis, the aim is to control the active colitis according to the guidelines of British Society of Gastroenterology. And in the patients with colitis that is poorly controlled or refractory to medical therapy may require pan-proctocolectomy. And this controls both the colitis and autoimmune hemolytic anemia such that concomitant splenectomy is not indicated. So if active colitis has been actively excluded, consider treatment as for primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So, and also then for this transplantation, that is a hematopoietic stem cell transplantation and solid organ. So here 2 to 4% of patients, they develop autoimmune hemolytic anemias after a median time of 3 to 10 months following allogenic stem cell hematopoietic stem cell transplant. And alloimmune hemolysis can usually be distinguished by its early presentation. So here the alloimmune hemolysis would be earlier, and autoimmune, and this would be because of the ABO mismatch or the antibody specificity. But this less frequently also this alloimmune hemolysis may be present due to mixed chimerism and blood group disparity. So in this case, in the cases of hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, these cases of DAT positive cases, we need to rule out the alloimmune component. So this would be present mostly in cases with ABO mismatch or anti, or if the or depending upon the antibody specificity, especially also the RH and KEL type also, and then they could also be secondary to mixed chimerism and blood group disparity. And serological investigation is aided by undertaking extended red cell typing of donor and recipient prior to transplantation. Alternatively, the samples stored following HLA typing can be retrieved for extended. So either prior to transplantation, we can go with this extended red cell typing, or those samples that have been stored for the HLA typing can be also used for this red cell genotyping if auto and pan agglutinins occur, and specifically ruling out LO antibodies of donor or recipient origin would be useful. Transplant associated thrombotic microangiopathies, this TMA and drug associated. So in the setting of transplant, we can not only have an alloimmune sort of a cause for hemolysis, but we can also have this, it could either be due to the transplant associated thrombotic microangiopathies and also drug induced because of the drugs that are given, these calcineurin inhibitors that are given post transplant. So it will be like a multi causative mm, uh, a multi-causative sort of environment where we have both alloimmune can also occur, alloimmune hemolysis can also occur, and from this mechanical hemolysis due to the thrombotic microangiopathies, and even drug-induced hemolysis can also occur with calcineurin inhibitors. And on top of that, we have this autoimmune hemolytic anemia component that can develop, and this may coincide with the CMV reactivation on or and the onset of graft versus host disease or relapsing disease. So mostly in those cases with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, we will consider autoimmune if there has been and if and the cause of the autoimmune would then be CMV reactivation or onset of graft versus host disease or a relapsing disease. So these are like four components of hemolysis that can occur. This can be due to autoimmune in nature, and it may be due to CMV reactivation or graft versus host disease, and or a lapsing disease that could cause this autoimmune hemolytic anemia, which develops 3 to 10 months after the allogenic hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So then we have to rule out all alloimmune hemolytic anemia, but in this occurs mostly 3 to 10 months after the allogenic hematopoietic stem cell transplant. Whereas an alloimmune, the features would be that it occurs earlier, and then there would be a history of some sort of a blood mismatch or antibody disparity or mixed chimerism. So this could rule out. We have to first of all rule out alloimmune hemolytic anemias also, and then if the patient is on calcineurin inhibitors, then this could also be a cause, and also transplant-associated thrombotic microangiopathies can also be ruled out. And then particularly if they are occurring earlier. So these autoimmune hemolytic anemias, they usually occur at a later stage, about 3 to 10 months after the allogenic hematopoietic stem cell transplant, and then they would signify that there may be just CMV reactivation or onset of graft versus host disease or a relapsing disease. And then we have these patients with, and the treatment here would then be that this autoimmune hemolytic anemia resolves in less than half the patients treated with steroids. and multiple agents are often required. So rituximab here, because this is in the setting of hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So rituximab is an effective agent here, and the patients respond to steroid and rituximab given first line. So rituximab is then given first line in those patients with this um, uh, hemolytic anemia, autoimmune hemolytic anemia, secondary to hematopoietic stem cell transplant. And in other cases, the other series rituximab first or second line resulted in complete remission. So either you could give rituximab as a single agent, or it could be combined with the steroids and or other immunosuppressive agents, and such as azathioprine, mycophenolate mofetil, and cyclophosphamide and alemtuzumab, and then as well as immunoglobulins and plasma exchange have also been used, and these would of course be for emergency management. And response to splenectomy was also reported in a series of 5 out of 10 patients. And so severity of autoimmune hemolytic anemia is variable, and although some patients they die of refractory disease, most deaths are secondary to infection, that is a CMV reactivation that we had discussed, and the relapse of the disease or graft versus host disease. So these were the main causes of autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and the death mostly occurred due to these causes, rather than due to the severity of anemia, because which is actually variable. So most just die because of the secondary infections and the relapse and graft versus host disease, rather than due to just the anemia component, because of course anemia would be well treated with rituximab and all these immunosuppressive therapies. It's just the secondary associations of infection and relapse and graft versus host disease that would eventually lead to death if the autoimmune hemolytic anemia persists. Now, we can consider pre-transplant storage of DNA from donor and recipient for genotyping in the event of developing of auto and pan agglutinations. And at the presentation of autoimmune hemolytic anemia, we need to reevaluate the chimerism and remission status, and assess for and treat infections and graft versus host disease. So these are our primary, let's sort of like uh, uh, um, the primary steps that we would take. We would actually reevaluate all the drugs and the donor and recipient phenotypes regarding the genotypes regarding their the HLA typing, the antibody profile, the chimerism studies, the remission status, and also the infection status and the graft versus host disease. So we need to actually reevaluate all of this before we consider any sort of um, treatment option. So if it is mostly drug associated, we just switch the GVHD prophylaxis from calcineurin inhibitors to other, and for other infections, we may need to treat the infections, and for those donor antibody ABO or mismatches, we shall need to consider these steroids and rituximab as first line. In some cases, even rituximab has been used as a first line also. So just a reminder, if I think we will be running out of time shortly, so we will just go on with the solid organ transplantation part of this. And if the connection somehow breaks because of the 40 minutes time interval for this Zoom session, so please reconnect using the same link that you used before. So we will join again in 1 minute, again using the same link. So solid organ transplantation, this autoimmune hemolytic anemia can also occur in adults, or also in 5 to 10% children following liver and or intestinal transplantation. So and also following pancreas transplantation. These would of course be very rare, but probably they are carried out in UK. So they have mentioned the liver and or intestinal and even pancreas transplantation. So unlike alloimmune hemolysis, which usually presents within the first few weeks, so autoimmune hemolytic anemia tends to present months or even years after the transplant. This is the same as for hematopoietic stem cell transplant, but there it was at least just about 3 to 10 months. So with solid organ transplantation, it can occur even up to years after the transplant. And the causative the causative conditions here are also the infections, that is CMV infection, the parvovirus B19, because of the long-term immunosuppression that they've received. They have these CMV, parvovirus, and Epstein-Barr virus associated post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorders, and this should be then identified. And then the evidence base for treatment is limited. Post-transplant immune suppression with tacrolimus is often reduced or switched, but the importance of this is debated. And first-line therapy is usually steroids, although response rates appear lower than in primary. And we can have like here also steroids and rituximab, and then we can also go on. But mostly, of course, it would be at presentation. We need to assess for and treat the infection or post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. Now, then we will also go into the management of EVAN syndrome, um, which is also one of the syndromes associated with these autoimmune conditions. We have gone over the SLE component in immune dysregulation. We went over the SLE, common variable immunodeficiency, ulcerative colitis, and all these transplants, solid organ and hematopoietic. And now in children, we will go over the EVAN syndrome, and then this childhood autoimmune hemolytic anemia associated with giant cell hepatitis. After that, we will come with the drug-induced hemolytic anemia, and I think that would be the end of this guideline. So we'll just take a short break of 1 minute, and then we'll rejoin again, and then we'll go over these childhood-associated. There's just 2 minutes left, so I think we'll just sort of take a short break in this session, and please rejoin using the same link that you had used earlier, because we will all reconnect again after 1 minute. So, okay, I'll be ending this meeting. Thank you.